The storm raged outside, its winds howling against the house, rattling the windows like angry whispers. Inside, the only sound was the steady ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner of the living room. It was a sound that once comforted David, but tonight it seemed to echo the emptiness inside him. David stood by the window, his broad shoulders hunched, fists clenched. His eyes were fixed on the darkened horizon, but his mind was a million miles away, trapped in a place he didn't want to be. He wasn't just watching the storm. He was watching his life unravel, piece by piece. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked to be left alone, to become the father of twins with no mother to help him raise them. The world had been cruel to him, taking Charlotte away just when they had everything ahead of them, just when the babies were born. "You're only here to care for my newborn babies, not to replace her," David muttered under his breath, his voice thick with bitterness. It was a quiet declaration, one that burned with every syllable. Ava, the nurse he'd hired, was the last person he wanted in this house, the last person he wanted near his children. But there she was, just like he had known she would be, walking into his life with that smile he couldn't trust, carrying the burden of his wife's death in her own way. And yet, all David could see was the empty space where Charlotte used to be. The door creaked open, and there she was, Ava, standing in the doorway with his newborn daughter cradled carefully in her arms. The soft pink blanket around the baby seemed too gentle for the harshness of this house, this life, and certainly too gentle for the storm inside David. David didn't turn to face her. He couldn't. His eyes were still glued to the storm outside, a reflection of the storm raging inside his chest. "I've got her," Ava said, her voice gentle, almost too soft. "Would you like to hold her?" David's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Ava knew better than to push him. She walked across the room, placing the baby in her crib, her movements deliberate, measured. But every step she took was a reminder that Charlotte was no longer here. That this woman, this stranger, was now taking her place in his home, in his children's lives. David's hands gripped the edge of the windowsill as if it could hold him together, as if it could stop his mind from spiraling further. His heart ached, raw and exposed, but he refused to show it. Not to her, not to anyone. Ava was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in front of her, standing by the crib, her gaze drifting between David and the baby. She didn't speak right away, knowing he wasn't ready for conversation. But her silence was thick with concern. Finally, she broke it. "I know this is hard, David," she said, her voice steady. "But we need to talk about—" "No," David interrupted, spinning around to face her. "You're here to care for my babies. That's it. Nothing more." His voice was sharp, a warning. His eyes, usually so calm and collected, were wild, desperate, filled with something Ava couldn't name, but she knew all too well. Pain, guilt, anger. Ava met his gaze, unflinching. She'd seen this before. The grief, the loss, the rawness of someone who wasn't ready to let go of the past. She had dealt with it in her own life. But David's anger wasn't just about Charlotte. It was about control, about losing something that he thought was his, and he wasn't sure how to get it back. "David," she started again, stepping closer, but keeping her distance. "I'm here to help, not to replace anyone, not to take her place. I know that's what you think, but that's not what this is." David's fists clenched again. "It doesn't matter what you think. You don't get it. You never will." Ava took a deep breath, trying to steady her own emotions. She wasn't here for him to like her. She wasn't here for anything other than to care for his children and to keep him from falling apart. "You don't have to like me, David. I understand that," she said softly. "But I need you to understand something. You're not alone here. I'm not replacing Charlotte, but I'm here to help you through this. To help you with them." She gestured toward the crib where the twins were sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm of emotions swirling around them. David didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his back to her, staring out the window again, this time watching the rain come down in sheets, blurring the world outside. He felt that familiar sting of tears in his eyes, but he swallowed it down, as he always did. He wasn't weak. He wouldn't let anyone see him break. Ava, standing behind him, gave him one last look. He wasn't ready to let her in, not yet. But she would wait. She would be patient. She knew how to navigate this. She had seen it before. As she turned to leave the room, she cast one final glance at the baby in the crib. She'd do what she was here for. She'd care for the babies. But she also knew this. If David didn't let go of his grief soon, it would consume him. David stood there alone in the quiet room, the weight of the storm pressing down on him, the sound of the rain pounding against the windows. He didn't know why he'd hired Ava. He didn't know if he could trust her. But what he did know was this: he couldn't keep living like this. Alone, lost in a past he couldn't change. And the thought struck him hard, right in the chest. Maybe it wasn't just Ava he was angry at. Maybe it was himself. David stood at the window for what felt like hours, staring out into the storm as if the rain could wash away his grief. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and love, now felt hollow and cold. The babies were asleep, but in his mind, they might as well have been shadows, reminders of the wife he had lost and the life he could never get back. Ava, standing in the corner of the room, watched him with a mix of concern and patience. She didn't know exactly what he was going through, but she knew pain when she saw it. She'd seen it in her own life, and it never got easier. She'd lost a sister a few years ago, someone who had been her closest friend. But this was different. She wasn't just a nurse in David's home. She was a stranger, a replacement in the most vulnerable of places, and he wasn't ready for that. But Ava was determined to be more than just a hired help. She had to be, not for her own sake, but for the sake of the twins who deserved more than a father lost in his sorrow. She moved quietly across the room, pulling the small rocking chair closer to the crib. The twins lay there, so tiny and fragile in the oversized crib. They looked peaceful, unaware of the storm that raged around them, both outside and within their father. "David," she said, her voice soft but insistent, "you should get some rest. I've got them settled, and I can take the night shift if you need a break." David didn't respond right away. His gaze was still fixed on the rain, and Ava's presence, though comforting, seemed to have no effect on the storm inside him. He couldn't understand it. Why he was so angry. Why he kept pushing her away. He wanted help, but at the same time, he didn't. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Ava had no intention of pushing him. Not yet. She knew he wasn't ready to talk. He wasn't even ready to look at her without that edge of hostility. Finally, after a long pause, David spoke, his voice strained. "I'm fine." It was the same response he always gave, short, clipped, and filled with something unspoken, something deeper than just frustration. Ava nodded, though she didn't believe him. She could see the weight in his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged, as if the whole world had been placed on them. He wasn't fine. He was broken, and he couldn't admit it to anyone. "David," she began gently, "I know you're not used to asking for help, but it's okay to need it. You don't have to do this alone." David's eyes flashed for a brief moment, and he turned to face her. There was a flicker of something in his gaze. Resentment, maybe, or fear, but Ava wasn't sure which. He'd been so angry, so closed off, she hadn't had a chance to see what was really behind his hardened exterior. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't let go." "Not yet." Ava froze. She knew what he meant. He was talking about Charlotte, the woman who had brought him into this world of parenthood, the woman whose absence had left an unfillable hole in David's heart. The grief of losing her hadn't just taken Charlotte. It had taken him, too. And Ava knew, from her own experience, that when someone loses a loved one, it isn't just the person who leaves. It's everything that person represented. Ava took a step closer to him, her heart softening despite the anger she knew was buried deep in David. "I'm not asking you to forget her," she said quietly. "But you can't keep living like this, not for yourself or for the babies." David turned away, his fists tightening, his jaw set like stone. The storm outside seemed to roar louder, matching his internal chaos. "I don't need anyone telling me how to grieve," he snapped, the edge in his voice unmistakable. "I don't need a damn nurse, and I don't need a lesson in moving on." Ava felt the sting of his words, but didn't back down. "Then what do you need, David?" Her voice was steady, calm, but there was a sense of urgency beneath it. "What are you holding on to? What's left for you to grieve?" He was silent for a moment, and Ava thought, just for a second, that he might answer her, that the truth might come tumbling out of him like a floodgate opening. But instead, David turned his back to her again, his broad frame a barrier she couldn't cross. "I'm not ready," he muttered, his voice quieter now, almost to himself. "I'm not ready to let go. I can't." Ava's heart ached for him. She had no idea how hard it must be to lose someone you loved so completely, someone who had been your world. She knew what it was like to have that one person who made everything feel right, only for them to be ripped away. But she had learned grief was not something you could control. It wasn't something you could push away forever. It would consume you if you let it. And David was letting it consume him. "I'm not asking you to forget her, David," Ava said softly, stepping closer. "I'm asking you to heal." David's shoulders tensed, and Ava could tell he was fighting with himself, struggling to keep everything locked away. She wanted to help him, but she knew that only he could decide to move forward. He had to be the one to take the first step. "You're not going to make me feel better, Ava," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "You can't fix this." Ava paused, her expression softening as she took a step back. She understood. "No," she whispered, "but I can be here if you ever want to talk." David didn't answer, and the silence between them felt suffocating. Ava stood there for a few moments, watching him as he stood by the window, alone in his grief. She knew she couldn't force him to open up. It would take time. It would take patience. But one thing was clear. She couldn't leave him like this. Without saying another word, Ava quietly exited the room, leaving David to his thoughts. She had her shift to take care of the twins, but her mind was still on him. She could see that he was breaking slowly, and it scared her. She couldn't let him break entirely. In the dark of the night, David stood by the window, the storm outside, now seeming like a distant hum. His eyes were fixed on the shadows outside, but his mind was racing with emotions he didn't know how to express. Ava's words echoed in his head, and for the first time since Charlotte died, he felt something other than anger and pain. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The house was quiet when David awoke the next morning. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air still lingered like a heavy fog. He hadn't slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Charlotte's face, her smile, the way she had looked when she first told him they were going to be parents. But that was a lifetime ago, a lifetime David couldn't reach anymore. The silence in the house was almost too much to bear. The twins were still asleep, their soft breathing a reminder that life moved on, whether he was ready for it or not. David rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the exhaustion that weighed down on him, but the pain in his chest wouldn't let him forget. He made his way to the kitchen, hoping to find some peace in the mundane. The familiar smell of coffee filled the air as he poured himself a cup. The aroma was soothing, yet it couldn't mask the bitterness that had settled deep inside him. He had spent the last few days convincing himself that he could do this alone, that he didn't need anyone, least of all Ava. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was lying to himself. As he stirred the coffee, the soft sound of footsteps behind him broke the silence. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. Ava stood in the doorway, her posture relaxed, but her eyes betraying the concern she carried for him. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. David grunted in acknowledgement, but didn't answer. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to face her, didn't want to admit that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about her. That her presence in the house wasn't as much of an intrusion as he had made it out to be. Ava stepped closer, her gaze softening as she watched him. "I know this isn't easy for you, David," she began, her voice low, almost soothing. "But I'm here to help you. I'm not going anywhere." David set his mug down with a little more force than necessary, the clink of the ceramic against the counter echoing in the quiet room. He turned to face her then, his eyes sharp with frustration. "You don't get it, Ava. You don't know what it's like to lose someone like that. To lose your whole world." Ava met his gaze without flinching. "I've lost people too," she said softly. "I understand more than you think." David scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you understand? You're not me, Ava. You didn't watch your wife die right in front of you. You didn't feel the life slip out of her, helpless to do anything but hold her hand." Ava flinched at the rawness of his words, but she didn't back down. She knew this wasn't about her. It was about David's pain, his grief, and the walls he had built around himself. "No, I didn't," she said quietly, "but I've watched people I love slip away. I felt the emptiness too." David's anger flared again, but this time there was a crack in his voice, a rawness that exposed more than he intended. "I don't need you to tell me how to grieve, Ava. I don't need your pity." Ava stepped closer to him, her voice calm but steady. "I'm not offering you pity. I'm offering you something real. I'm offering you help. But I can't do it if you keep pushing me away." David's jaw clenched, and for a moment, the tension between them was unbearable. His mind raced. Part of him wanted to shut her out, to tell her to leave, to remind her that she wasn't part of this life. But something inside him, something deeper than the anger, told him that maybe she wasn't the enemy. Maybe she was the only one who could help him find his way out of the dark place he had been trapped in since Charlotte's death. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned back to the counter, his hands gripping the edge, trying to steady himself. His chest ached with the weight of everything he had been holding inside. He hadn't realized how much of it had spilled out until now. "I'm sorry," David muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't looking at her, but he didn't need to. His apology was for more than just the words he had said. It was for all the pain he had been holding on to, the way he had shut everyone out, even when he needed them most. Ava stood still for a moment, watching him. Then, slowly, she approached him. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "I understand more than you know. Grief isn't something you can just shake off. It doesn't go away just because you want it to." David took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he exhaled. It was as if a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying was starting to lift just a little. Ava's words were like a lifeline, but he was afraid to reach for it. He didn't know if he was ready. "You're right," David said, his voice thick with emotion. It's so hard. I don't know how to be here for them, how to be here for myself." Ava placed a hand gently on his arm, her touch light but comforting. "You don't have to do it alone, David. I'm here to help, but you have to let me in. Let me help you carry this." David closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the sincerity in her words. He didn't want to, not yet. But the more he fought against it, the more he realized that he was running out of options. He couldn't keep holding everything inside, pretending that he had it all together. Not when his children needed him. Not when Ava, in her quiet way, was offering him something that he had been too proud to accept. "I don't know if I can," David said, his voice barely audible. Ava nodded, understanding. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. But I promise you, it's okay to lean on someone." David nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small glimmer of hope. As he turned back to the crib, his eyes landed on the twins, sleeping peacefully. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, but it wasn't just a burden anymore. It was a chance to move forward, to heal, to be the father his children deserved. And for the first time since Charlotte died, David felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a sudden release of all his pain, but it was a crack in the wall he had built around himself. A crack that just might let some light in. David stood motionless in the kitchen, his mind racing. The morning had felt like a blur, with Ava's gentle presence in the house reminding him that everything was changing. He still didn't know how to navigate this new reality, but part of him couldn't deny the pull to do something different, to let go of the anger and guilt that had been suffocating him for so long. But the weight of it all was too much. The memories of Charlotte, the helplessness he had felt when she passed away, the overwhelming responsibility of caring for the twins. All of it felt like a suffocating blanket pressing down on him. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the storm raged on. He hadn't spoken to Ava much this morning. They'd fallen into a routine, her quietly tending to the babies while he stewed in his thoughts, avoiding any conversation that would force him to confront the mess he'd made of everything. He didn't want to talk about Charlotte. He didn't want to talk about how he had failed her, how he couldn't even seem to find the strength to get out of bed some days. But he couldn't keep pretending anymore. He couldn't keep pretending that he wasn't hurting, that he wasn't broken. Ava had been patient, understanding, but there was something in the air today, something that felt like it was about to snap. David felt it before he even saw her. The tension in the room grew thick, like a cloud ready to burst. Ava was standing in the doorway of the nursery, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had always been calm, composed, but today there was something different in her eyes, a firmness he hadn't seen before. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly, but there was no mistaking the quiet authority in her voice. "And I get it. I really do. But you can't keep doing this, David. You can't keep shutting me out." David stiffened. The anger flared up in him almost instinctively, but he swallowed it down. He couldn't do this, not again. He had already fought too hard to keep everything locked away. "What do you want from me, Ava?" he snapped, his voice rough with frustration. "What do you expect me to say? That I'm sorry? That I'm ready to move on? Because I'm not. I'm not ready for any of this." Ava didn't flinch. She just stood there, looking at him, her gaze steady, unwavering. "I don't want an apology, David. I don't want you to say you're ready to move on. I just want you to stop pretending that you're okay. You're not okay, and that's okay. But you need to let someone in. You need to let me in." David felt a surge of something he couldn't quite identify: shame, anger, maybe even fear. He didn't know what it was. All he knew was that Ava's words were hitting him harder than he expected, breaking down the walls he had spent so long building around himself. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know how it feels to watch someone die in front of you. You don't know what it's like to feel like everything you loved is just gone. It's not that simple." Ava's voice softened, but there was a quiet strength in it. "I know it's not simple, but that's not the point. You're holding on to the pain, David. You're holding on to the grief like it's a part of you that you can't let go of. But it doesn't have to define you. You don't have to let it consume you." David's chest tightened at her words. He could feel the tears threatening to break free, but he pushed them back, willing himself to hold it together. He couldn't cry. Not now. Not in front of her. "You think you could just fix me, Ava?" he asked bitterly, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can come in here and wave a magic wand and make everything better? Because I'm telling you, it doesn't work that way." Ava didn't flinch. She took a step closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm not trying to fix you. I'm not trying to make everything better. I'm just trying to help you heal. You don't have to do this alone." David's eyes burned with the weight of it all. The grief, the guilt, the anger, it all came crashing down on him in that moment. He was so tired of carrying it, so tired of pretending like he had control over everything. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Ava's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. It was gentle, calming, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David didn't pull away. "You don't have to be sorry, David," she said softly. "You're allowed to be broken. You're allowed to feel lost. But you're not alone. You don't have to do this on your own anymore." The words hit David like a punch to the gut, but they weren't just words. They were the truth. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the tiniest flicker of hope. It wasn't much. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough to start. David let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he took a step back from her. He was still angry, still hurt, but something inside him was beginning to shift. He didn't know how he was going to make it through this, didn't know how he was going to heal, but maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do it alone. As he looked at Ava, standing there with quiet strength and understanding, he realized something else. He didn't have to have it all figured out. He just had to start. And for the first time since Charlotte had died, David felt like maybe that was enough. The early morning sunlight filtered through the half-open blinds, casting soft patterns across the hardwood floor. The house, once a place of silent mourning, was now starting to feel different. David wasn't sure how to describe it, but the tension in the air had lifted just a little. The anger, the grief, it was still there, a heavy presence in the back of his mind. But now, there was something else, a small sliver of hope, something that had been missing for a long time. David sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, but he wasn't drinking it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past few days, the fights, the silences, the moments of clarity. Ava's quiet persistence had finally broken through. Her words, the ones that had stung so badly in the beginning, were now starting to make sense. He had spent so long trying to control everything, trying to hold on to what he had lost. But the truth was, he had never really had control. Not over Charlotte's death, not over his grief, not over the pain that kept him up at night. He had tried to bury it all, to lock it away in some dark corner of his mind. But it had a way of creeping back, always lurking, always reminding him of what he couldn't fix. And yet, Ava had been right. He couldn't heal if he kept running from it. David let out a deep sigh and rubbed his face with his hands. He had been walking around in a fog for so long, trapped in his own bitterness and pain. But something had shifted, something that felt both terrifying and liberating. Ava had shown him that it wasn't about forgetting. It was about living again despite the loss. It was about moving forward, not to replace what he had lost, but to make something new out of the pieces that were left. The sound of soft footsteps broke his thoughts, and he looked up to see Ava standing in the doorway, her arms crossed as she watched him. She had an air of quiet understanding about her, something that made David want to close the door again, lock himself away, but he didn't. Not today. I know you're still hurting, Ava said gently, her voice calm, like she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. And I know it's not going to happen overnight, but you're not the only one who's been carrying something heavy. David nodded slowly, his throat tight. He couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too big. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't the only one who had suffered. Ava had her own scars, her own past, her own pain. She had lost her sister, someone she had been close to, and had probably carried that grief with her every day, just like David had carried his own. David cleared his throat and stood up slowly, his legs a little shaky, but he felt grounded in a way. I didn't realize how much I was holding on to, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ava nodded, her eyes soft but knowing. You don't have to hold it all, David. You can let it go, piece by piece. David swallowed, trying to steady himself. The idea of letting go, of surrendering to the pain and the grief, had always terrified him. But something about Ava's words, the way she had been there for him without expecting anything in return, made him realize that maybe it was time to stop fighting. I don't know how to do this, he confessed, looking down at his hands. They were trembling, but he wasn't sure if it was from the weight of his emotions or the fear of what would happen next. Ava stepped closer, her presence calming, like a balm to his raw emotions. She didn't have all the answers, but she was offering something David hadn't expected: understanding, patience, and the simple act of being there. You don't have to know, David. You just have to take the first step. That's all. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. The storm inside him wasn't over, but it was starting to clear. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about living through the pain, accepting it, and choosing to keep moving forward. As if on cue, the soft cries of the twins from the nursery reached his ears. The sound, once a reminder of his pain, now felt different. It was life. It was love. It was everything that David had been fighting to hold on to. He turned to Ava, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to soften. He wasn't alone. He didn't have to be. "I'm not ready to be perfect," David said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "But I'm ready to try. I'm ready to move forward." Ava smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to carry all the weight of their unspoken understanding. "That's all I'm asking. Just take it one step at a time." David felt something inside him shift, a weight lifting from his chest. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was enough to start. "I'll help with the babies," David said, his voice steadier now. "I'll do what I can, but I need to learn how to do this. To do it right." Ava nodded, her eyes warm with approval. "And I'll be here every step of the way." For the first time in months, David allowed himself to believe it. To believe that healing was possible, that he could be a father, a man, and someone who could live with the loss, not be consumed by it. As he walked toward the nursery, the sound of the twins' cries no longer felt like a reminder of everything he had lost. It felt like a reminder of everything he still had. He wasn't done grieving, not by a long shot. But for the first time, David realized that he didn't have to carry the weight alone. Ava had helped him see that. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for him yet. David sat in the quiet of the kitchen, his hands wrapped around his steaming mug of coffee. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow across the room. The house, which had once felt suffocating, now seemed a little less oppressive. The twins were upstairs sleeping, and Ava had just finished feeding them. For the first time in what felt like months, David felt like he could breathe again. But as the quiet settled around him, a new tension started to creep in. The relief he had felt in the past few days was fleeting. He had made progress, yes, but now he was facing something far more difficult. Something that had been building ever since Ava had entered his life. He had been avoiding the decision, pushing it to the back of his mind, but it couldn't stay there forever. His mind wandered back to the conversation he had overheard a few nights ago. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words still lingered in his memory, sharp and cold. "You can't keep living in the past. You need to move forward. There's more at stake than just your grief, David." Ava's voice had been steady, but there was something in it that made him uneasy. Something that made him question whether he was truly ready to let go of everything he had held onto for so long. David had always been a man who prided himself on control, on knowing what was coming, being able to make decisions and stand by them. But now, in this quiet kitchen, he realized that the one thing he couldn't control was his heart. And right now, his heart was telling him he needed to make a choice. A loud knock at the door startled him out of his thoughts, and he quickly stood up, his pulse quickening. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, he found Ava standing on the porch, her expression neutral, though he could see the slight tension in her shoulders. She had been holding something, a small envelope, tightly in her hand. "David," she said, her voice low but firm. "We need to talk." David stepped aside to let her in, though he didn't move any farther. He could feel the weight of her presence in the room, her eyes scanning the space, searching for something she hadn't yet seen in him. She was here to confront him, to push him further toward the choice he had been avoiding. "What is it?" David asked, his voice guarded. Ava hesitated before stepping forward, handing him the envelope. "I know you've been struggling. I know it hasn't been easy for you. But now you need to make a decision, David. You need to make the right choice for everyone involved." David opened the envelope slowly, his hands trembling ever so slightly. Inside, there were legal papers, documents that made his stomach twist. The words property transfer stood out, but his eyes moved quickly down the page. "You have a choice," Ava continued, her voice steady, though her eyes were filled with a certain intensity. Your wife's estate was never finalized the way you thought. It's all in these papers. The ranch, everything your father built, none of it legally belongs to you. Not like you thought." David froze, his eyes still glued to the papers in his hand. He could feel the floor beneath him shifting, his whole world beginning to crack. He had spent so long thinking he was in control, thinking that his life had a clear path forward. But this was something different. This was a revelation that shook him to his core. "What do you mean it doesn't belong to me?" David asked, his voice hoarse. His head was spinning, the documents in his hands no longer making sense. Ava stepped closer to him, her face softening with empathy, but the message in her words was clear. "It's all here, David. Your mother never signed the transfer documents. The ranch, the property, everything is in her name. And now you need to decide whether you want to fight for what you thought was yours or let it all go." David's heart pounded in his chest as he reread the documents. His mind was clouded with disbelief, anger, and something else, fear. He had thought he was doing everything right. He had thought the ranch was his legacy, something he could build upon. But now, standing in his hands were the very papers that proved everything he had built was built on a lie. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Ava watched him carefully, then took a deep breath. "You have to choose, David. You can keep fighting for what you think you deserve, or you can let it all go and make a different kind of life for yourself. But it's up to you." David's mind raced as he processed the information. There was so much at stake. He had spent so long holding on to the past, thinking he could reclaim the life he had lost, the one Charlotte had taken with her. But now that life seemed so distant, so unattainable. The ranch, the legacy, it was all slipping through his fingers like sand. The choice wasn't easy. He could feel the pull toward his old life, the life he had always known. But what did that life really offer him? Was it worth all the pain, all the loss, all the anger? His gaze moved over to the crib where the twins lay, peacefully sleeping. They didn't know any of this. They didn't know about the ranch, or the wealth, or the documents. They only knew what they needed: a father who would love them, a father who would be there for them, not one who was trapped in a past he couldn't change. David's heart sank, and for the first time, he felt a quiet resolve settling in his chest. The choice was clear, even if he didn't want to admit it. He looked up at Ava, his eyes meeting hers with new clarity. "I can't keep fighting for something that's already gone. I can't keep fighting for something that's not mine anymore." Ava nodded, a small, knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips. "It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, David, but it's also the right thing." David stood still for a moment, the weight of his decision settling in. It wasn't just about the ranch. It wasn't about the money. It was about the future, his future, and the future of the twins who depended on him. "I choose them," he said softly, but with certainty. "I choose to move forward." Ava's smile widened, relief flooding her expression. "I'm proud of you, David. You made the right choice." David looked down at the papers in his hand one last time before setting them down on the table. He wasn't looking back anymore. He was ready to move forward, to heal, to rebuild, and most of all, to be the father his children deserved. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ranch as David stood on the porch, looking out at the land he had once believed was his inheritance. The place that had been his whole world for so many years now felt strangely distant. The tall grasses swayed in the wind, but the familiar sight didn't stir the same feelings in him anymore. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The morning had been quiet, peaceful, even. He had spent some time with the twins, holding them in his arms, listening to their soft coos and cries. Their tiny hands grasped his fingers, their innocent faces filled with a pure love that he had long since forgotten. It was that moment, right there in the nursery with the twins, that he had known, truly known, that his decision had been the right one. David had chosen to move forward. He had chosen to stop clinging to the past, to the anger and grief that had been suffocating him for so long. He had chosen to let go of the ranch, of the legacy he thought he was entitled to, and to focus on what truly mattered: his family, his future, and his own healing. It wasn't easy, and he wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he was ready to find out. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie, and he turned to see Ava walking toward him, her smile as warm and steady as ever. She had been there for him through it all, and though he still wasn't fully sure of everything, he felt a deep gratitude for her presence in his life. "How's everything?" Ava asked softly, her eyes studying him, as if searching for some hint of doubt. But there was none. "I'm okay," David said, his voice steady, though the weight of his decision still lingered in the air. "Better than okay, actually. I feel like I'm finally ready to let go." Ava nodded, her smile widening. "I'm proud of you, David. You've come so far." David looked out across the ranch, the land that had been the setting for all his most painful memories. But he didn't feel anger anymore. He didn't feel trapped. For the first time, he felt like he had made a decision that wasn't based on fear or grief, but on something real, on his love for his children and his desire to be the man they needed him to be. "I never realized how much I was holding on to," he said, his voice quieter now, as if sharing a secret with the wind. "I didn't realize how much it was weighing me down." Ava stepped closer to him, her presence a comfort he hadn't known he needed. It's hard to let go of something that's been such a big part of your life. But sometimes the hardest thing is the thing you need to do most. David turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of hope. Not the kind of hope that came from wishful thinking, but a grounded, steady hope. A hope that came from knowing that, no matter what, he had a choice. And he had made it. "I know it won't be easy," David said, his voice a little more certain now. "But I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to do it for them, for my kids." Ava placed a hand on his arm, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "You're doing it for yourself, too, David. You're doing it because you deserve peace. And you deserve to live a life that isn't weighed down by regret." David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had always thought that healing meant forgetting, that moving on meant leaving everything behind. But now, he understood that healing didn't require him to forget. It required him to live with what had happened, to carry it with him, but not let it define him. He looked at the land once more, but now he saw it with new eyes. The ranch, the legacy, it wasn't his to claim anymore. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, alive, with his children, with Ava, and with the possibility of a future he could embrace. "Thank you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Ava smiled softly, but her eyes were filled with understanding. "You don't need to thank me, David. I'm just glad to see you moving forward. And you're not alone. You never have to be alone." David nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. He had made the right choice. And now it was time to build something new, something that wasn't just about surviving, but about living. "I'm ready," David said, his voice strong. "Ready to start over." Ava nodded, her eyes sparkling with approval. "Then let's do this." David stood tall, his heart steady for the first time in a long while. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he could face it. He had learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it and finding the strength to move forward one step at a time. As he looked down at the twins, still sound asleep in their crib, he felt a quiet peace settle in his chest. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning.